good to be here. I hope you can hear me in the back. Is that right? I should like to thank in particular Ev Lesky and Rachel Cookell, Lana Sweck from the Archives, and James Winderlich and Wendy Mayer from ALC, who oversee this annual event and have invited me to address you on a topic that's very close to my heart. A hearty thanks also to Alice Lamdeck, James's executive assistant, who's done an incredible job helping me with the nuts and bolts at the business end of this project. I too would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting this evening, the people of the Kaurna Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Any helpful insights that may emerge from this talk can only be ascribed to the many kind people who have been generous enough to respond to my emails and phone calls, or to speak with me in person when I've turned up on their doorstep. I haven't had the opportunity to spend a great deal of time listening to the voices of Indigenous church workers. Instead, I've focused on reading widely and gleaning my findings from those who have listened to them most closely over the years, mainly a goodly number of FRM support workers, past and present. The paper's shortcomings remain the shortcomings of a fly-in ALC lecturer. As one of a number of fly-ins, I have to say that I've thoroughly enjoyed the opportunities my employment at ALC gave me to mingle with the support staff, the incarters, as the pastors are called, the evangelists, and the camp cooks, and lead the Bible studies at half a dozen or so courses over the past 25 years, from Irulcha, northeast of Alice Springs, heading towards Queensland, to Docker River, almost on the Western Australian border, before right in between those extremities. Let me admit too that the paper is the work of somebody who always looks forward to flying out again after 4 nights sleeping under the stars without showering, to return to the comforts of home and resuming life as an ivory tower academic, now retired. This year's oration will start with a brief history of the bush courses. I think James has given you a bit of a summary already, lead into a description of a typical bush course, and then describe some of the perennial issues that invariably surface during the courses and continually vex the minds of the FRM support workers, the FRM board, the indigenous church workers and the wider church. These issues inevitably morph into questions that the LCA continues to grapple with as it seeks to do justice to the vital task of preparing Indigenous church leaders for their calling and supporting them in it. Aboriginal incarters are included on the roll of pastors as specific ministry pastors, SMPs in short. Most start their training as evangelists, reaching out with the gospel, leading Bible studies, teaching Sunday school and confirmation classes, assisting in worship, and testing their calling to see if they should prepare for ordination. Whether as incarters or evangelists, Aboriginal church leaders invariably serve their own people in their home locality, having received the vast majority of their training from their FRM field worker at home base. There are very good practical reasons for providing pastoral training for Aboriginal ministry candidates among their own community. Finances. Considerable cost is involved in a move to Adelaide with travel, tuition, accommodation and general living expenses. Community development. An education provided on country means that more than one person can be taught at the same time. Indeed, the whole community can share their journey and surround the candidate or candidates with encouragement and support over the long haul, both during their time of training and as they carry out their ministry. Education level. Many of those who have grown up on a remote community and have been identified as potential leaders will probably not have the education level or the English language skills that readily allow them to make the transition to theological studies in Adelaide. But deeper issues are also at play. Aboriginal people who have achieved their HSC and maybe even gone on to study at university level, possibly with a view to pursuing theological studies, will have lived for some time and are far removed from the culture and customs, the beliefs and practices of their community. One school of thought proposes that it then becomes difficult to re-establish connections, as willing as the people involved may be to do so. They'll be seen to have developed an esoteric body of knowledge backed up by a certificate that confers a degree of authority that hasn't been earned where it counts, on country, and therefore doesn't necessarily confer the respect that goes with the office of pastor. The aura they have acquired by their wider experience can have the effect of compelling people, however unintentionally, to accede to their authority and submit to their wisdom. As with so many issues, this school of thought finds itself in tension with the goal of ensuring that Aboriginal pastors receive the kind of theological education and pastoral formation that is equal in breadth and depth and quality to the offerings of ALC. Bridging this gulf between the real and the ideal remains a work in progress. In a letter to the dear departed John Fitzner when he was serving at Hermannsburg, Field Superintendent F.W. Albrecht wrote, "So many attempts, and very honest attempts, have been made to get ministers from among the Aborigines by training them in accordance with the white youngsters at our primary schools, colleges and seminary. But this has failed every time it was started. On the other hand, men who have a thorough understanding of the way of salvation as we find it in the New Testament, and who have proved themselves, like Colin, Albunka, and Titus, he didn't throw in the surnames, but I think it was Renkaraka, is it right? Renkaraka, Pastor Titus, in the field, can and will accept responsibility for this work." End quote. This and other words of wisdom from Superintendent Albrecht come from Barbara Henson's book, A Straight Out Man, F.W. Albrecht and Central Australian Aborigines. History of the bush courses, very brief at this stage. Paul Albrecht, I think I saw him somewhere over here, yes, shared with me that today's bush courses for Aboriginal pastors and evangelists had their origins in the years immediately following the Second World War, when his father, F.W., gathered Aboriginal lay leaders from various communities together once a year to train them to do evangelism work among the people in the regions out to the west of Hermannsburg. I think probably that included the north and the south as well. Paul says he can still picture the annual event. About a dozen men would gather under the shade of a large gum tree on the church grounds at Hermannsburg for their annual refresher course. It went on for 4 weeks and was always held immediately after Christmas. The courses were held at Hermannsburg because it was regarded as the spiritual heart of the FRM, and also because the cattle herd meant that meat was readily available for the meals. In the book Hermannsburg, A Vision and a Mission, L.H. Lesky writes that the schools were held twice a year. And David Rohnfeld says that he had heard that they were held 3 times a year, after Christmas, Easter and Pentecost. Presumably the frequency varied over time in those original years. The first Aboriginal men to be ordained as pastors were Conrad Rubber and Peter Buller on 15th of November 1964. 16 more ordinations followed in the years from 65 to 85. From these humble beginnings at Hermannsburg, worship centres were established in several communities, radiating out from Alice Springs for about 320 kilometres in all directions, with a view to having either a pastor or an evangelist placed in each. Albrecht and various Aboriginal leaders would also visit other places every so often, such as cattle stations like Henbury and Murray Downs, to take services and provide Christian instruction. Today, there are 23 Aboriginal Incarters on the LCA's roll of pastors, and about 30 others are serving in various roles. That might be a little bit of a low figure, I suspect. In the course of time, the bush courses were held as often as 3 times a year on a rotating basis at the various centres of the mission field, with a faculty member providing the main biblical and theological input, with odd exceptions. It's been a rare privilege for ALC faculty members to work with such luminaries as erstwhile FRM Director, Pastor Paul Albrecht, and field staff such as Gary Stoll, Max Stolznow, John Heffernan, Hans Oberscheit, John Fitzner, Ken Hansen, Norm Wurst, Paul Traeger, it's a bit of a long list here, Steve Radke, Andy Gieris, Rob Borges, David Moore, Paul Eckert, David Roenfeld, Peter Fitzner. I think Basil Schultz needs to be in brackets. I don't think he was ever a support worker, is that right? Daryl Mattner, Neville Dakey, a regular helper employed by Australian Summer Institute of Linguistics, David Strickland, who's fluent in Almatra, and a recent addition to the team, Pastor Michael Jacobson with his wife Hannah from the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Bavaria. Michael was installed as support worker among the Al-Yarwa speaking people at Urulcha last Sunday, or was it Utopia?
Urulcha.
Urulcha. Right, thanks to you. That is they. At the time of this, as the title of this talk indicates, it is essential to note that the bush courses play only a small role, and nevertheless a vital role, in the preparation of Aboriginal people for their work as pastors and evangelists. The bush courses are simply not the main game. Rather, they're the equivalent of an intensive study period or a short stint of professional development. The main game is the one played by the FRM field workers who support, encourage and mentor the Aboriginal leaders, provide them with the teaching and resources necessary for their ministry, and the pastors themselves as they exercise their ministry week in and week out and encourage others to follow in their steps. Now, I think there may be some shots up here. Take a little break and I can have a little sip of water and you can look at some of these pictures. And if you recognise any of the characters, just comment on them to your neighbour. Dean's Wax, you can see there Daryl Mattner and Carl Rickler, the present company. Pastor Ron McNamara, is it not? That's what they look like. That's Dean in full flight. Bob Kennedy's supplied some of these as well. Who's the man on the right there? Who? Food wagon. What's it called?
Tucker wagon.
Tucker wagon. Very ute and you. Tom Hitch leading a course. Was it last year maybe? And watching the Compass program, the Bush Preachers. What do the courses do for the attendees? Well, first, they provide the ideal context for intensive learning to take place on location. More often than not, the focus has been a set book of the Bible. Less commonly, there's a call for a course on the catechism or conducting the liturgy or preparing for regular Sunday services or services for the festivals or funeral services or baptism or confirmation services. And in recent years, 2 courses have been held on the topic of personal health and well-being. Secondly, answering the question, what do they do? Secondly, as John Heffernan explained, the courses have been invaluable in bringing people together from across the language groups who normally had nothing to do with each other because of distance and cultural divide. Fellowship in Christ at the courses has helped to overcome suspicion and distrust of people from other communities with whom they may have been at loggerheads in former times. Thirdly, with pastors and evangelists coming together for 3 or 4 days from the length and breadth of the church in the centre, the opportunity is created for sharing experiences, gaining wisdom and insights from those who have stayed the distance, supporting and encouraging one another in the highs and lows of ministry, and simply becoming better acquainted with the work of the wider church. John Heffernan told me that the Bush courses tended to serve as a virtual pastors' conference plus synod, all of it wrapped into one bundle. The synod in the bush, pastors' conference in the bush. And Ken Hansen wanted to stress that at least a couple of hours were set aside so the indigenous church leaders could discuss issues close to their heart, ranging from basic matters such as lack of money or the provision and maintenance of cars to other far deeper and more complex issues. This is a business meeting that's held always in the afternoon, the last day of the course. Being part of a forum where they could hear other pastors raising similar issues to their own invariably proves highly therapeutic, with prayers then being offered and strategies developed for dealing with the issues that have arisen. Fourthly, in terms of what do the courses do, the field workers themselves also value highly the opportunity the bush course provides to take time out with their peers for a period of refreshment through mutual conversation and consolation, to be built up in the gospel and to do some forward planning. Not so much a fifth point as an exclamation point. One field worker shared with me that most of the Aboriginal pastors and evangelists hold the bush courses in high regard. They're quite special. The people ask him things like, when's the next one? Where will it be held? Who's going to be the teacher? What's the study topic? And sixthly, the attendance of faculty members at the bush courses creates the ideal opportunity to undertake the final assessment of a candidate's readiness for ministry. Therefore, if the field workers jointly have decided that somebody is ready for ordination, time is set aside during the bush course to assess the candidate's knowledge of the Bible and church teachings and his pastoral competency. The candidate is supported by his fieldwork mentor during the interview and by one or two colleagues. A joint report prepared by the lecturer and the candidate's support worker approving the candidate for ordination is forwarded to the College of Bishops and the FRM board. The candidate's successful completion of an oral assessment by a faculty member is seen to provide a vital link with ALC and thereby the blessing of the LCA for the ordination that usually follows soon after. Most of you will be very familiar with the map that shows the various language groups. The courses move around from one community to another depending on which community extends the invitation to the others to come to their country, the source of some pride for the host community, I'm led to believe. They're held in the remote bush communities associated with the various language groups, mainly Alyawara, Amachara, Pintabuluracha, Pintachara, and central and western Arunta. The field workers do the initial organisation, and then the local incarters and evangelists prepare the country by grading and raking the ground, ensuring that the road is clear, and supplying wood for the fires over which the meals are cooked, which keep the people warm. The courses are held outdoors under a shady clump of trees. Inclement weather may mean that a course has to start late or end prematurely, or an unforeseen event in one of the communities may mean that some participants arrive late or return home before the course finishes. One that I was meant to attend, and did actually get to Alice Spring last year, was called off because of all the sorry business. There's so many deaths that happen in communities, and also the weather was particularly inclement, extremely hot. I think everyone was getting ready for the big trip too, to Germany. So that was all of those combined to cancel the course. There are 3 teaching sessions each day presented by the teacher who's flown in for the occasion, 2 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon, interspersed with extensive periods of hymn singing in language. One of the first items each day is a sermon text study presented by the field workers each in turn, designed to help the incarters in their sermon preparation for the coming Sundays. Daily devotions are led by the Aboriginal incarters and evangelists with readings, prayers and hymn singing. On the Tuesday evenings of each course, the local community turns out for an evening's entertainment with gospel songs and various presentations, and invariably a movie, usually based on Bible stories. In the early days when I went up, when I started teaching here, there used to be westerns more often than not, a lot of action, but Gary Stoller then left the centre and we became very biblical. The movies are projected onto the side, or they used to be, onto the side of one of the 4-wheel drives. Now that we've got that beautiful screen that I saw, it seems to be a recent arrival on the scene, or they're shown in the local church or community centre. Typically, the courses last from Sunday evening till Thursday early afternoon, so quite long. Teaching is steady and meticulous. The teacher presents the material in English, and then what has been said is repeated in language by the respective field staff members to the people from the areas for which they have oversight. The teacher divides the material into bite-sized chunks, normal process of translation, manageable, not too much for the interpreter to handle, usually in self-contained thought units. One of the retired support workers, Ken Hansen, told me by email that if he could tell the organisers who prepare the program one thing, it would be that they tell the faculty members to prepare about half as much material as they usually do, and then divide each teaching session into two, one for presenting material and the other for group discussion. Group discussion hasn't always been encouraged, speaking for myself, and the indigenous attendees are reluctant to interrupt with questions, but far better learning would come from pre-planned discussion times in the various language groups. That's Ken's advice for faculty members would be that they be ready to present far less content, carefully determining the few things they really need to say, and leave room for far more reflection and discussion. New section headed around the campfire. The bush courses also provide ample opportunity for the support workers and the Indigenous pastors and evangelists to work through with one another the countless difficult issues that their work requires them to tackle. These conversations take place at the business meeting on the final day of the course, or they surface during the evenings that are lengthened by the absence of artificial lighting and warmed by the embers from the campfire that are still glowing after the evening barbecue. Bible translation into Indigenous languages, one such topic of conversation. Should translations correspond formally to the original Hebrew and Greek? Or is it better to provide a looser but more accessible dynamic equivalence or idiomatic translation? Formal correspondence may be more faithful to the original, but without access to commentaries or even study Bibles to provide insight into difficult words or concepts, does the more precise translation actually serve Aboriginal pastors and their communities well if the translation remains partly or even largely incomprehensible? On the other hand, the more accessible dynamic equivalence approach may result in translations that have to be much longer than the original text in order to make the meaning clear. They're therefore better described as commentaries or paraphrases rather than as translations. A related issue is the recognition that the biblical text is often quite open-ended and allows either for a range of interpretive possibilities or for intentional double or even triple meanings. Should that open-endedness be retained in translations for people for whom one clear meaning is of paramount importance? Take, for example, the description of baptism as second birth, being born again, in the Gospel of John, where the Greek words also mean birth from above. Or the Old Testament term, the Lord of Hosts, Yahweh Sabaoth, where the word hosts has three distinct meanings, but the word hosts itself doesn't specify precisely what even one of those possibilities might be. The Incarnators don't have access to commentaries that explain such matters. Bearing these issues in mind, some translators who prioritise accessibility but also want to avoid overly long translations produce what have been called Reader's Digest translations, which omit words, concepts, or even portions of the Bible that would take many extra words to give the meaning accurately, or translations which omit words and concepts that don't immediately appear to have equivalent words or concepts in Aboriginal societies. Others have argued, on the other hand, that the translator should never resile from the struggle to find the right word, no matter how long and difficult the process. The primary concern of the translator, it is said, is to ensure that the Bible, the written word of God, determines the wording of the translation, not an overarching desire for accessibility. It's a rare privilege for faculty members to become eavesdroppers in such an important discussion, and maybe even participants in it. Secondly, topic, traditional Lutheran worship and hymns. Very interesting feedback on these topics. Traditional Lutheran worship and hymns. Questions that arise in the mind of interested observers, such as an ALC lecturer, may also prompt discussion at the bush courses. It soon becomes apparent that the hymns used at devotions and in worship invariably reflect the rich heritage of Lutheran hymnody. With rare exceptions, the melodies are those that the LCA has inherited from Germany, adjusted as necessary to conform to Aboriginal rhythms and word patterns. One wonders whether there is resistance to using contemporary church music. How do we know who come in from the outside? Even hymns and songs composed by Aboriginal Christians, and if so, why? Here, as with so many items, the proverb holds true: the one who first states a case seems right, until the other comes and cross-examines. The first case that I heard regarding this matter was that since the missionaries brought the liturgies and hymns of the church from Germany, and Lutheran Germany at that, and then spent inordinate time and energy translating and teaching the liturgies and hymns that they brought with them, the conviction arose among the emerging Aboriginal church that these should be preserved in the form in which they had been received, because they represented the authentic Lutheran liturgical tradition and should now be incorporated in their purity into the ever-emerging and evolving Aboriginal dreaming. True worship required nothing less, so new gospel songs should be reserved for evening sing-alongs and not used in Sunday morning worship, not even for the devotions at bush courses. But then somebody had the nerve to cross-examine that opinion. The reason the older material is used, it was said, is because that is what is mostly available in the resources the church has produced, with odd exceptions. Therefore, the people simply stay with what they have access to. Then a third voice chimed in. The older musical forms have actually contributed to a decline in our churches because the young people are drawn to more upbeat music that they encounter at Baptist and Pentecostalist churches. Young and even not so young Aboriginal superiors are eager to adapt and change, but out of respect for their superiors, that's meant to be church members, young and not so young members are pretty eager to change, to go with the times and so forth, but out of respect for their superiors, their elders, they don't feel free to introduce changes, nor have those in positions of authority given permission for changes to take place or provided the resources for more contemporary forms of worship and music. What's more, a former support worker said, despite the vast repertoire of traditional hymns available, there is a tendency to select an increasingly small handful of familiar favourites, which rarely fit the readings, the theme of the service, or the sermon. Whereas the guidance from people well versed in worship and hymnody, that could turn this trend around. Another former support worker reminded me of George Rosendale's observation from his time as pastor at Yalata. The people who were moved to the mission at Yalata did not feel at home with the Lutheran hymnody they encountered there after their previous experience with AIM mission songs. AIM stands for Australian Indigenous Ministries. Rosendale believed that this change affected the vibrancy of the church at Yalata. With such a debate ringing in this observer's ears, I couldn't help being struck by the very next proverb in the book of Proverbs. Casting the lot puts an end to disputes and decides between powerful contenders. Third issue, law and gospel. Another regular topic that support workers are eager to discuss is their concern that the ability to distinguish between law and gospel is not always evident among Indigenous church workers. Rather, the default position is to distinguish between the right way that a person should take in life and the wrong way. This meshes readily with ways of thinking that are inherent within Indigenous culture, and it gains support from the Bible's wisdom tradition that is manifest in texts such as Psalm 1, that distinguishes between the life-enriching path that the righteous take and the self-destructive path of the wicked. This even seems to fit comfortably with Jesus' parable of the two householders, the one who builds his house upon the rock and the other who builds his house upon the sand. However, when choice between the two paths is taken as a starting point, the gospel readily becomes Jesus' invitation to choose God's right way and his warning not to continue on the path that leads to eternal destruction. The question arises as to the extent to which the people have gained a deep understanding of justification in terms of God declaring us righteous for the sake of Christ as an act of pure grace. At the same time, the support workers can see that it also has to be said that overall, the Aboriginal pastors and evangelists appear to have a good understanding of the sinfulness of humanity, and that God quite amazingly forgoes the payback that sin requires and instead fixes our sin to Christ on the cross and there throws it away for us. Indigenous views of law and justice make the concept of the remission of wrongdoing and payback readily accessible. But the dominant understanding persists in some quarters that God lovingly draws people into his family so that they might then be put on the right way. That's where one's eternal confidence rests. Such a view sits in uneasy tension with the teaching that God embraces sinful humanity with love and forgiveness unconditionally for Christ's sake, and in his grace calls us to follow in Christ's footsteps in the power of the Spirit. Gospel and culture. The hardy perennial topic around the campfire is the discussion about the relationship between Indigenous culture and the Christian gospel. FRM field workers no longer subscribe to the former view that Indigenous people should completely discard their traditional culture in order to be faithful to the gospel. Whereas some of the early missionaries assumed that Aboriginal people lacked any sense of religion, F.W. Albrecht, among others, came to the realisation that they could never have survived the harsh struggle of life in the bush without a strong spiritual background. Albrecht became convinced instead, and I quote, "They are among the most religious people in the world. The fact is that their whole life, from early infancy to the last day in this world, was surrounded and entirely lived within their religion. There is nothing else that could have carried them through." End quote. Initially, Albrecht thought that practices such as the harsh discipline of boys by their fathers were at odds with the Christian faith and should be discontinued. But he learned that if the missionaries interfered with such practices, boys would grow up without allegiance to strong authority figures and without direction in life, to their endless harm. Even the typical European concern for tidiness and cleanliness led to the ready assumption that the people lacked a true sense of religion. Because, quoting Albrecht Sr. again, there are many Christians to whom it was gospel truth that cleanliness comes next to godliness. Now in the centre, the people hardly had enough water to drink and cook a meal now and then, but seldom enough to wash themselves. To enforce our way of life on such people at the same time as they are taught the Bible, and insist on them keeping clean and tidy in order, very often, to show others what we had achieved with them, is just plain nonsense. He was a progressive man. It was remarkable to read all that stuff. FRM in general and the support workers in particular have taken significant steps towards embracing a highly nuanced perspective regarding these matters. One member of the team shared with me that it's vital for Aboriginal traditional customs and religious practices to be known and understood as thoroughly and clearly as possible. And then it is equally vital that Aboriginal Christians should work out for themselves how to draw on their culture in the service of the gospel, the practice of the ministry, and the welfare of the community, and to discern those aspects that are at odds with the Christian faith and should therefore be discontinued. Let me hasten to add, as I bring this section to a close, that if one were to analyse the campfire discussions more closely, it would quickly become apparent that they're not quite so heavy as the foregoing might suggest. While the items mentioned do emerge from time to time, the fact is that most of the time is devoted to light-hearted banter, as it should, hobbies, family matters, and addressing the specific pastoral care needs of the members of the group. But what about the women? Joy Worst, wife of Norm Worst, was leading Bible studies for Indigenous women in Alice Springs and the town camps during the 80s and 90s. Paul Traeger's Bible study courses in the Pintupi-Luritja lands often had women present from the beginning. Everyone was welcome. So if these could be replicated across the centre, some felt, there'd be no need for women's camps. But the women said they felt far more comfortable if the men weren't around. In fact, the stories they shared were often about the men. When Deborah Myers and Peter Fitzner went to Daria in 2007, the women indicated that they would like to be part of something like a women's guild along the lines of what Joy Worst used to organise in Alice Springs. With Lily Roenfeld and Marion Swift as chief movers, sessions started at Nataria, but they were poorly attended because, with key responsibility for nurturing their extended families, the women found it hard to take time out during the day for extra events. But well aware of what was being done to equip the pastors and evangelists, they knew they weren't receiving the education, support and nurture they desperately needed to carry out their significant teaching and leadership roles in their community. After all, the women played a leading role as Sunday school teachers and confirmation instructors in the 60+ Lutheran communities in the centre, not to mention Christian instruction in the schools and the other pastoral care work they were engaged in. So Deborah suggested a women's camp, a Bible study retreat, with prayer and singing and encouragement and mutual support. Before long, the first one was being organised. The Aboriginal women themselves set clear guidelines. No children were to be present. Few white women were to attend. Women were to be invited from all the Lutheran communities in the centre, and they were to organise all the domestic chores and see to the lion's share of the teaching, mentoring and supporting of each other. In a follow-up email, Deborah wrote, the women's camps were for the Aboriginal women. They were therefore responsible for as much of the organisation and input as possible. That's why they didn't want many white women attending. They take over. They just can't help it. Child rearing and breastfeeding have made it hard for the younger women to attend. So in addition to prayer and Bible study, the camps have included topics like church leadership and mentoring younger women so that they could be cared for when the others returned home, and in due course also assume positions of leadership. Indeed, some of the women have taken the initiative and gone on to tertiary studies at Nungalinya, the Indigenous Bible College in Darwin, where people like parish worker Rita Okai from Mutijulu have completed a Certificate 3 in Christian Ministry and Theology. At the very first camp, and as the only white woman in attendance, and with little Aranta, Deborah said that she crawled into her swag long before the others that first evening. She wrote, the women continued to sing and talk, telling stories and laughing, so excited to be together. I went to sleep experiencing a deep sense of joy and peace, coupled with anticipation for what the next day would bring. Initially, it was hoped that the 2 women's camps could be held each year, but the amount of organisation required and the start of the choral work under Maurice Stewart soon made it hard to hold more than one of them. The annual women's camps continue today, now facilitated by the Aboriginal women's support worker Sue Antikov. They are much shorter than the men's bush courses, lasting all day Saturday until lunch on the Sunday, 1.5 days. A new section. The formation of Aboriginal pastors and church workers. During the 1980s, the FRM field staff decided the time had come to produce a standardised curriculum of studies for preparing candidates for ordination, the length and breadth of the church in the centre. Training had been patchy, differing greatly from community to community depending on a host of variables, such as the teaching skills of the respective field staff member, the priority they gave to the work, the topics that each regarded as the basic minimum requirement for preparing candidates for ordination, the attendance, ability and literacy level of candidates, and their commitment to their studies. The task of writing the curriculum was given to Mr. John Heffernan, whose work was checked by other support workers and reshaped and edited by Pastor Everard Lesky. The topics covered in the curriculum were chosen by the senior staff members based on their many years of service in the centre. Preparation of the curriculum, here we have it in living one colour, 205 pages and so on. Started in 1990, that's the preparation started then, and was ready for general use in 1993. It was the fervent hope and prayer of the staff that the uniform curriculum taught consistently and conscientiously across the widely scattered communities would strengthen the ministry and support the growth of the church through Central Australia. That was the 1980s and early 1990s. And many people, I think Pastor Ron McNamara might have been the first at Nappy, would have been the first one, I think, ordained with the new having gone through the complete program, and is still used to this day. During the 1990s, the FRM board asked that the Aboriginal Ministry training program be placed under the authority of Luther Seminary and officially recognised by the LCA as an alternative pathway to ordination. A formal relationship between the FRM board and Luther Seminary was envisaged, with one board member and one faculty member jointly responsible for liaison. These dates become interesting. In 1998, the FRM board asked Pastor Peter Miller to represent the board in this role. And Bob Kempy, Greg Lockwood, Andrew Pfeiffer, Stephen Peach successively might be another one, is that the whole kit and caboodle? That's pretty good. Have represented ALC, starting with Bob's appointment in 2001. As I understand it, Stephen, and before him Andrew, now works directly with the FRM support workers rather than through a board representative. Would you nod at that? I think they work as a team rather than through the... Tim's nodding. Among countless others who have played leading roles have been Andrew Yench, who has served as Assistant Liaison Faculty Rep in Queensland, and Colin Hayter, who has mentored trainee pastors on South Australia's west coast, chiefly at Yalata. In parallel with these developments, the then LCA President, Dr. Lance Dykey, appointed a standing committee on Aboriginal issues, which produced a wide-ranging final report called We're All People, which was presented at the Melbourne General Convention in 1997. The distinguishing feature of the committee's work was their wide consultation with Aboriginal Lutherans across the church, not only Central Australia, but also far north Queensland and the west coast of South Australia, and their careful listening to what the people had to say about the interface between the church and their communities. During his years as faculty liaison person, 2001 to 2008, Bob Kempy also visited these three regions and became keenly aware of the importance of carefully selecting Aboriginal candidates for ministry, thoroughly preparing and forming them for ministry, and intentionally nurturing and supporting them following their ordination. In line with the conclusions of We're All People, Bob was eager that a new curriculum of studies be prepared to become the accredited pathway to ordination for all Indigenous candidates for ordination throughout the LCA, not just in the centre. Bob hoped that ALC's diploma in theology could be used as a basis for a revamped curriculum, which would give the program a strong biblical and doctrinal foundation, supplemented by the best elements of the existing Heffernan curriculum, on Heffernan's work here, 205 pages, and a range of electives that would address matters that pertain specifically to Aboriginal ministry, while being flexible enough to cater for a range of ability levels and the characteristic features of different communities. He also suggested that Indigenous candidates should spend time at one of the Indigenous Bible colleges, either Nungalinya in Darwin or Wontook Biboya in Cairns. Once prepared, the course would continue to make extensive use of the various field workers for its delivery. I believe that the hope is still held that a completely new curriculum of studies for the training of Indigenous pastors will be prepared by the faculty in consultation with the field workers, drawing on the best from the current FRM curriculum and the offerings of Nungalinya and Wontook Biboya. But despite various appeals from the field staff, ALC has not yet formulated a complete curriculum. I've been away for 2 years, so I may be missing something here. That's probably, if it's the case, because it's such a tall order. Resources would have to be provided and a person employed to develop such a curriculum. And that person, or preferably that team, would have to be conversant with the characteristic learning styles of Aboriginal candidates and sensitive to a wide range of cultural issues. This means that the main curriculum for the training of pastors and evangelists remains the existing curriculum that is employed throughout the various fields in the centre. It's exciting to see that the Reconciliation Action Plan currently underway in the LCA has as one of its stated goals growing the career ministry paths for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from the May issue of the Lutheran. In addition to the training and formation of Aboriginal candidates, Bob was also deeply concerned about what happens when they had completed their studies and were regarded as fit for ordination. In a report written in April 2007, Bob made a number of recommendations that he believed would prove a boon to the ministry of Aboriginal pastors among their people. Two of the main recommendations were, firstly, that the LCA draw up a document of call applicable to the ministries undertaken by Aboriginal Incarters within the FRM communities, flexible enough to incorporate a tailored covenant for a specific community and its Incarter. And secondly, that the first placement consists of an 18-month probation period in order to identify any theological and pastoral formational issues that may require attention and to test the suitability of the placement. At the end of this period of probation, Bob recommended the Incarter and the community would be led through a process of review, after which the assignment would become a called position or be revoked. The formation of FRM field workers is the support staff. No less important than the formation of Aboriginal pastors and evangelists is the vexed issue of the selection of field staff/support workers, their preparation for the work, their orientation to the field, and their ongoing support. The field workers have specific responsibility for preparing Aboriginal candidates for ordination by mentoring and encouraging them every step of the way until that day when the whole support staff team, together with the candidates' community, regard them as ready to be ordained. Traditionally, the first and fundamental step in that process has been teaching the aspiring Incarters the literacy that is required for the work of a pastor, teaching them to read and write in their own language if they can't already do so. And then over an extended period, they're taught how to lead Bible studies, teach the faith, lead worship, preach the gospel, keep records, and provide pastoral care to their people. With this kind of job description, it's not hard to see why proficiency in the language of the people is a vital component of an effective ministry. A proficiency best gained through a sustained presence in the community, with a view also to forming close, trusting relationships. In a letter to a representative of what was then called the British and Foreign Bible Society, F.W. Albrecht wrote in 1966, "Religion is closely bound up with our feelings, and if people are to be approached with the gospel truth, this is best done through the language where they have their deepest feelings, their mother tongue. It is from here where their whole life is permeated, every aspect of it." End quote. Needless to say, language acquisition would be hastened by enrolment in the Australian Summer Institute of Linguistics at Kangaroo Ground in Melbourne, with courses in basic linguistics plus fieldwork and units in Aboriginal history and culture. Based on his listening tours, Bob concluded that the best scenario would be for support workers to commit themselves to learning the language of one Aboriginal language group, with a view to working closely with the people of that community for extended periods. Of course, it's easy to become nostalgic about former times when people with names like Koleski and Petering, Pech, Albrecht, Stoll, Hansen, Fitzner, Moore, Reinfeldt, Oberscheit and Eckert were active, and what it meant for the growth of the church that such people were willing to dedicate themselves to living among the people regularly under extremely adverse conditions and acquiring fluency in their language. At a time when there is a renewed appetite in the wider Australian community for recovering Indigenous languages, and there's a resurgence of Indigenous pride in general, in the interest of the general health and well-being of Indigenous communities, how much more shouldn't this be a feature of the life of the LCA, for whom language acquisition has been an integral part of our church's DNA from day one. The authors of We're All People pull no punches when they describe the characteristics required of support workers, the challenges they inevitably face and the ongoing support that they need. To quote, Our impression is that support workers are not always selected or screened carefully enough, given sufficient training or orientation, provided with the necessary in-servicing, or given the special support needed during their ministry. Procedures for screening people to discern their attitude to working with Aboriginal people and their aptitude for cross-cultural ministry ought to be a basic consideration for the future." End quote. Stephen Peach, present company, told me recently that similar considerations have led him to the conviction that ALC should seek to identify candidates for the ministry who demonstrate the desired characteristics and then give them as much exposure to the work as possible during their years of formation, including study periods at Nungalinyo or Wantuk Biboya, field work and even vicarage under the supervision of a seasoned field worker. Again, from We're All People, working in a cross-cultural ministry can be stressful, and some felt that the LCA, through the relevant body, should make sure that people ministering to Aboriginal people are given special support and encouragement. Some thought this support had not always been present, especially in remote areas. Our impression was that there is a danger that non-Aboriginal people become disheartened, disillusioned and even cynical in spite of their love and concern for Aboriginal people when they're not adequately supported in their work. End quote. As has been made clear, the bush causes are only a small cog in the far larger wheel of the theological education and pastoral formation of Indigenous church workers. The LCA's ministry of on-the-spot Indigenous pastoral preparation has been hailed as a unique feature of our church's work. It is the privilege and responsibility of FRM support workers to be engaged in that unique work. To say it again, FRM's field workers have responsibility for the theological education of our church's Indigenous clergy and auxiliary workers. Maybe not doing it all, but certainly seeing to it that it is done. It's basically a ministry of oversight, theological education and pastoral formation, a major task in anyone's language. God willing, and with the Spirit's guidance, the Church will redouble its efforts to do justice to the identification, preparation, orientation and ongoing support of field workers. As difficult as that may appear, such efforts are far more likely to lead to a satisfying and rewarding ministry than asking people to embark on the work poorly prepared and therefore with idealised notions of what the job entails. This paper hasn't drawn back from giving you a sense of the depth and the breadth of the topic of preparing Indigenous members of the Church for their ministries in the centre. The signs are promising that the LCA has the heart and the will to continue the vital task of listening carefully to Indigenous voices, to revisit past studies, to treat their recommendations with due seriousness, and to keep on integrating the best findings into a workable vision for the ministry of the Church in the centre that enjoys the total backing of the LCA at every level. Thank you.